than coming here. So if there's a slight delay between what I say and it opening up, that's the reason. Anyway, we're hopeful that will all go to plan. So thank you really very much for giving the opportunity to kick off this event with my ideas about implementing assessment change at institutional departmental level. Whoops, just got to. Okay. It's working, so that's good. It has become increasing frustration to me that although assessment's been firmly on the agenda of institutions for several years now, thanks to things like student surveys and university league tables, it continues still to be largely not fit for purpose. And my views are echoed by a recent book by Ashwin and his colleagues, who note that assessment really is one of the most conservative features of higher education courses. Indeed, sorry, I keep clicking the wrong button. I have to get used to the one on the webinar. Indeed, Peter Knight, writing way back in 2002, he described university assessment as the Achilles heel of quality. And I don't think the situation really has changed significantly since then. In addition to poor student satisfaction levels and increasing student complaints and appeals related to assessment, we have considerable scholarly evidence that of variability between universities and a lack of fitness for purpose for 21st century higher education. However, we're not short of consistent and well-researched knowledge of what effective practices might look like. Emma Medland, I don't know whether Emma's here today actually, but anyway, she's kind of described it quite well, or summarised it quite well, I think, when she talks about the assessment literature calling for assessment to be a central aspect of curriculum design and development that's integral to teaching and learning rather than an afterthought. It advocates the coordination of assessment across programs of study with an emphasis on methods that encourage the students to develop as learners. But for the purposes of this talk, I don't intend to dwell on that fairly consistent advice and evidence that we have regarding improving assessment. I think that material is relatively easily accessible, in textbooks as well as in articles, although I admit there's some contentious areas. My interest here today, and I hope yours is in coming to this, is the difficulty of implementing that advice across programs, departments, and particularly institutions. I will make the point, though, that in the light of widespread agreement over what is needed to transform assessment practices, it's not only really frustrating, but I think it's a matter of ethics. It's unethical, really, I think, following Bovell and colleagues talking about another aspect of change, that we don't improve assessment practices when we know that many current approaches have a negative backwash on student learning, they're poor preparation for work and life beyond university, and in many cases can't be demonstrated to be valid, fair and transparent. But I mustn't give the impression that there have not been multiple efforts to change assessment practice, and vast amount of money has been spent, and I've kind of put the logos of lots of different things there, LTSN, TQEF, LTA strategy, Kettles, GIST projects in the UK. There's been lots of stuff that I've come across through the Office for Learning and Teaching and the Australian Learning and Teaching Council before that in Australia. There's a multi-state collaboration in the States. There's been many, many more internationally that I've missed out or don't know about or forgotten. And indeed, this conference and our conferences over the years have been testament, really, to the wealth of interesting and innovative work that's been carried out by individuals and programs and institutions on assessment. And I think it does have to be recognised that many of these initiatives have transformed practices at the level of individuals and small teams. Many departments and institutions have claimed to have put considerable effort into reviewing their assessment provision, and there's undoubtedly been a big expansion in assessment methods. But notwithstanding all this activity, what have we really got to show for it? Despite all the efforts of people in this room and many, many others, I don't think we can claim transformation. In fact, a recent GIST report talks about it being stubbornly resistant to change. Medland, Emma, again, she talks about the weak alignment between what the literature is calling for and actual assessment practices. And she notes, that things like policy changes that have gone on, so in the UK, the Burgess report recommendation, it wanted to change institutional practices, but it's really just tinkered at the edges. we haven't seen significant change. So the sorts of areas where we have problems with assessment, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but I think you'll know them here, but they're about things to do with validity, balance of formative and summative, the huge growth in summative assessment, the atomization of assessment into just individual modules, the over-standardization of assessment, many parts of the assessment cycle, you know, from assessment design right through to kind of moderation and exam boards are really not informed by the evidence we have from research. Unsustainable feedback, students' confusion about it, poor comparability and reliability of standards, fudged standards generally being fudged, and issues about integrity of academic standards, and many more that you can think about probably in this room. So there are lots of issues that we need to consider. Okay, so what did I try and do? Well, in order to consider this problem, I've reviewed a kind of eclectic range of evidence on implementing change, and I've looked at learning, teaching and assessment, but actually there's very few studies that are just about trying to change assessment. I tend to look at empirical work that have actually evaluated change initiatives more than theoretical studies, although I do draw on theory a little bit. I've also, what's going on here? It's gone funny.
Okay, that's fine. You're
okay. Two. My heart.
I know.
Yeah. Okay. I've also talked to a number of people, some of them in this room, who are involved in implementing change initiatives in institutions to try and supplement those studies. And I've used this evidence to kind of try and ascertain with what we might say is complete conceptual clarity, I think, things that get in the way. That's about as far as I've got with the conceptual clarity at the moment, things that get in the way. And so I've been working inductively from people's experience rather than kind of deductively from theory. So those things that get in the way, they include people challenges, current approaches to how we try to change things, and other more tangible barriers. So for the purposes of this talk, and because it's a shorter word, I'm going to call them barriers, but they are more general, I think, than barriers. I think the most striking point to emerge for me in doing this is the shockingly long list of things that get in the way of assessment change. You know, the overarching message seems to be that transforming assessment is very difficult. But I have tried to develop some logical ways forward from the individual barriers in the hope that maybe by looking at them together we might find some ways forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those barriers now. The first one relates to centrally imposed change. I'm talking centrally with institutions here. I've witnessed institutions where policies, for example, to ban exams in the first semester or to require formative assessment, they've been introduced by very well-intentioned managers or senior committees. You know, there's good intentions there. However, Knight and Trowler suggest that the danger of imposed change is that it tends to produce resistance. And they talk about an active backstage and under-the-stage culture of cynicism and resistance that those kind of changes generate. We may all be familiar with that. And managers then end up complaining that people are anti-change, whereas Fuller would say that actually the problem is that the change leaders, they're not really making sufficient effort to understand the values, the ideas, the experiences of those who are essential to that change. So we may be able to engineer an appearance of change through top-down edicts, but scratch the surface and things remain pretty much the same. For example, there's a very nice little paper written by people at Southampton Solent where they tried to introduce grade-based marking. They wanted to change the marking culture. And they did manage to get all the marks approved through the new grading scheme, but they found that many staff were really only complying. They were just backfitting their number-based percentage marking onto the grade-based scheme. You know, no real change in marking practice has been achieved. So it seems to me that the kind of response to this barrier would reinforce the importance of designing and implementing change initiatives really in collaboration with those involved. And as Jessup says, respecting the autonomy, the agency, and the disciplinary knowledge of the programme teams that we want to work with. At the other extreme, stream, relying on individuals to drive change is unlikely to promote wider transformation. In practice, many of the initiatives to enhance assessment, from things like new lecturer courses, staff development, staff conferences, scholarship of learning and teachers, web resources for staff and things like that, they've all been predicated on the idea of developing individual staff. And as Trowler and Ashwin and Saunders, who've done a recent report on this, argue many government-led policies for change in this area, particularly certainly in the UK, I can't argue that elsewhere, but based on the idea that the agency of individuals can lead to change through their attitudes, their behaviours, their choices. However, this approach really disregards both the influence of the individual's immediate work group and broader structural constraints that they face. And this is where I'm drawing a little theory. And drawing on social practice theory, we can see that individuals are really powerfully influenced by their immediate work context, their work group. So in assessment, that'll be things like the teaching teams, the program teams, and maybe their departments, the people they work alongside. And in those work groups, academics build a shared discourse and a shared understanding of everyday assessment. So they'll talk about things, that are very context specific. They'll say, we do it this way around here. This is what we do in our discipline. We have to do it that way. It's what our discipline expects. This is what our students expect, what they're used to. So this sort of social practice approach stresses the situatedness, not a very easy word, the situatedness of assessment knowledge. People are saying and doing things which begin to take on the kind of mantle of relatively permanent local rules. People begin to believe that they're rules rather than sort of cultural norms and ways of doing it. Consequently, those work groups, those programs, those departments that we want to change, they filter, they adapt proposed changes according to that culture, and the outcomes become unpredictable and often not as intended. Another university I've worked with recently, they had this rule to drop all winter exams because they wanted more formative assessment. But actually, what the academics did is they all just did in-class tests instead. So, it didn't have that effect because they didn't really work with, to come to what they might have done. So I think this analysis does help us to think about a response. It helps us to locate a kind of site for transformative action, which I think is the immediate work group. That's where we should be focusing it, the teaching team, the program team. And it also suggests that we really do need to consider the influence of the perceived beliefs and rules on those teams, on those groups of people. Finally, this is rather a long barrier, I have to say, in relation to a focus for change, that report, the Trowler and Ashwin Saunders report, they found that most government initiatives to enhance learning and teaching and assessment tended to focus on innovations and on educational enthusiasts and specialists, us lot in a sense, the usual suspects. They didn't focus on developing what they describe as everyday teachers and everyday teaching. And this approach means that barriers to involving all those teachers are overlooked while you're focused on those people, and suggests that our transformative change may need to be less ambitious and focus on everyday assessment practices rather than innovations, and general teachers rather than specialists and innovators. So, okay, a little sip of water. And I'd like to talk about some of the structural factors, but I think even if we focus on everyday teachers at the work group level, there may be difficulties caused by the structures, both formal and informal, which create the underlying barriers for change at an organisational level. I think these could both limit work groups' room for manoeuvre, but also influence their workings. So, first of all, a particular structural barrier to transforming assessment at institutional level, I think, can be the restrictions or the directions that are embedded in formal regulations, policies and processes. One result, as Jessup, McNabb and Gubby found out, is that teachers are not negligent, passive, lacking in commitment, or completely unaware of formative assessment. However, they do accept the power of the validation system and the message it conveys about the preeminence of summative assessment. So I think a clear response to this is the need for closer working between academic developments and the people driving assessment change and the quality assurance functions in universities, ensuring that regulations, quality procedures support the kind of change we want. Modular structures. A further structural barrier to assessment reform is the ubiquitous prevalence, those two words mean the same thing, I think, don't they, of modularization in most higher education systems. This atomized approach provides a packaged, tick-offable, administratively convenient organizational approach for building and assessing courses. And I can't imagine anyone out there, and I'm not suggesting it, has much appetite to return to something more administratively complex, even if it's better suited to learning. But I think such modular structures heavily constrain assessment change. For example, in trying to get academics to focus beyond their own module and their own module assessment to create a much more integrated assessment experience for students. Modularization is particularly unhelpful to assessment reform where students have considerable choice, because that prevents any sense of a coherent program or a coherent program team and staff. A further aspect of situatedness, that kind of local context, is that people in different positions and parts of an organisation experience different and multiple influences on their action. So Saunders, in something else, notes that implementation of change takes place in a multi-level, multi-actor environment. Actors have positions and interests in this complex social system, that they affect how they view, use and implement change. So in relation to assessment, we can imagine that senior managers, for example, they're going to focus on things like performance indicators, student satisfaction, publicity, institutional reputation, those sorts of things. Whereas quality assurance staff may have very different priorities. They may be more interested in having simple, clear assurances of standards, easily managed, consistent procedures, and fair, equitable processes that avoid student complaints and appeals and stand up to external quality review. So it's not surprising, is it really, those different actors, I mean, we're not even started talking about teaching academics there, but they're going to be looking for different things in relation to assessment. And of course, the multiple influences on individuals creates conflicting demands. We're all fully aware, aren't we, of the research pressures which might prevent willing academics from, giving time or energy to assessment innovation. So again, thinking about the response to this, I think it means that we've got to prepare for the inevitability that intervention will be perceived differently by different people, particularly those in different kind of roles or parts of the organisation. And implementation may be restricted because of those conflicting demands. Apart from anything else, this latter barrier indicates that we really need to listen to the views of different constituencies and work in collaboration with them. Okay, so a final structural hindrance to transformative change in assessment is attributed to the lack of appropriate discourse to have assessment conversations. The question is, how can you address change using concepts and tools based on the kind of dominant techno-rational view of assessment? Medland, Emma, it's a great article on assessment evaluation if you're interested. She points out powerfully that this dominant discourse means that the teacher who neglects to summatively assess would be in really, really big trouble if you didn't hand in your grades and do stuff. But who's going to get into big trouble if they don't actually make their assessment learning orientated? She says, that's not likely to happen. Jessup and her colleagues, they argue that the official discourses of university assessment are enshrined in program documents, things like program specifications, module descriptors, course approval templates. And these QA documents rarely engage with the idea of formative assessment. Traumer argues, in relation to social practice again, that social practice always involves artifacts like these, which shape performance. We can think about that with assignment cover sheets, that we stick on the front of student work. They're a really good example of an artifact that influences feedback practice, how it's conceived and how it's communicated to students and staff. At one institution, as an example of this, there was a recognition by a committee that the importance of formative assessment. So they started putting formative assessment as a requirement on the module descriptor, the form people had to fill in when they were validating modules. But of course, in practice, that ended up as being just perceived as an extra assignment, an additional burden to staff and to students, rather than consideration of how formative assessment might be, and the associated feedback might be well integrated into the teaching and learning program. So I think the desired effect was not achieved, partly because those designing the sheets, the assessment cover sheets, really had an underdeveloped view or undeveloped understanding of formative assessment, and partially because the way the academics interpreted it. So I think that is a key issue. And I think it means that our response to that, there's a vital importance to review the underlying assumptions of that assessment that are conveyed through our institutional documents, our communications, and even the language of institutional meetings when we talk about assessment. And I think in particularly course approval documentation is central to this, looking at that. Okay. So assessment literacy, that's been a kind of trendy thing to talk about, hasn't it, for a few years now. Generally speaking, we've been talking about it in relation to students, but it's not been the subject of many studies in relation to staff, but there is growing evidence of staff's variation in their understanding of assessment. And that, I think, is a barrier in itself if staff do not have good assessment literacy. Lees and Anderson suggests very sensibly, with a bit sort of pie in the sky, that if an academic has the authority to set work and student work, they should be fluent and fully literate about what the function, process and outcomes of that assessment is. But of course, it's just not that straightforward. Lecturers' understanding of assessment is very much related not only to their conception of teaching, but also to the demands of the regulatory frame that they operate in. Forsyth and colleagues at MMU, they suggested the lack of assessment literacy means that practices remain traditional despite the freedom to change. They become constrained more by people's assumptions, their culture, their traditional practices, than regulatory limitations. And I think that's certainly the case. I think the UK Quality Code for Assessment actually is both permissive and supportive of transformative assessment practice. However, individuals at many levels in universities don't know this, and they hang on to myths and they blame quality requirements for not being able to make changes. Low levels of assessment literacy also have other repercussions, because various writers contend that staff will not engage in something new unless they share the educational beliefs that underpin it. Okay, that is, they see some benefit in the change, they see some profit to be gained from adopting the new practice. So whilst assessment literacy levels are low amongst academic staff, it's going to be difficult to get them to gain commitment to change, because they don't necessarily see the benefits in making that change, just the trouble really. And in fact, all of those people I talked to working in institutions on this, they all talked about how much it takes to convince staff that they need, to accept a need for change in the first place. So Lees and Anderson conclude that innovations need to think about the assessment literacy of all stakeholders, both the educators and is as important as the students. So what about the challenge of changing assessment literacy then? Scott and Hawke's view is that staff will be most interested in professional learning when they've identified a gap in their practice that they know they must address. So this is at the point where they actually do want to access improvement solutions that have been developed by others, developed by people here who've had to face the same problem. I think this supports the tester method. I haven't time to describe tester now, but Google it. Tester method of providing staff with triangulated quantitative and qualitative evidence of assessments, which often proves to be problematic. Because that becomes a spur, after I think quite a lot of anxiety and argument, it becomes a spur to developing a better understanding amongst those staff, and then work on implementing change. It also suggests that sharing institutional departmental change efforts, things that have been successful, will be useful to staff, but only once the staff are actually interested in improving their assessment, and not in advance of that. Just a few more quick other, I told you there's a long list of barriers. Additionally, we're trying to transform assessment at a time when resources are constantly being shaved off higher education and workloads are high. Do you know when that was written? That was written in 2000. Scary, isn't it? So staff lack time to invest in new approaches to assessment. And indeed, in some ways, that kind of financial pressure may be sending assessment in the wrong direction, you know, towards more online, auto-markable sort of, well, tests that can have a role to play, but, you know, often people don't have the time to invest in doing them well anyway, and there are lots of limitations. So I think this would suggest, you'll see there, that we should look for workload-neutral change as a minimum, and a reduction in assessment work if feasible. And I actually do think that's not impossible, because when we think of replacing the resource-heavy summative assessment with other forms of learning-orientated assessment, I think we can reduce the workload to staff, certainly in the medium to long term. Okay. Risk and penetration. And assessment has a high degree of penetration into many areas of university life. Many staff are involved, both academic and administration, and many others, particularly students, of course, have a legitimate interest in assessment. Consequently, this vast number of actors involved in assessment means it's harder to change than, say, teaching, and that's proved hard enough in itself, isn't it? For example, that Southampton Solent example again, they noted that institution-wide assessment change can affect almost all students simultaneously, and therefore feels really risky in terms of things like institutional quality assurance, academic standards. So it's not surprising in a way that a tidy assessment system that uses established methods and well-regulated processes for setting, marking, moderating student work gives those involved a sense of low risk and meets accountability criteria. But there was a lovely study by Crook and colleagues in 2006. They found that tidy assessment systems, I'm using that term tidy, I don't think they did, but tidy assessment systems that make quality people happy, they don't necessarily produce a good experience for students. So we can all imagine practices which may be more learning orientated for students but could be perceived of as risky. You know, things like having different assessment regimes and different assessment workloads in different modules. That gets people wound up, doesn't it? Maybe using untried methods that haven't been used before. Self-peer group assessment. Sharing with students, what I'd love to do, sharing with students the difficulty of professional judgment. And Forsyth did find this in their work at MMU, that staff were really anxious about their assessment responsibilities. It did feel risky. So, in addition, the permeation of assessment work among so many people creates a difficulty, I think, in gaining a balance between autonomy at the work group level and sufficient level of consistency and fairness to mitigate risk at the institutional level. And it was interesting at MMU, they tried to tackle that by focusing on the assessment task cycle all the way from sort of setting work right the way through to exam boards. Rather than individual responsibilities, and focusing on that cycle helped distinguish where decisions were academic or procedural, and helped clarify expectations for staff. So, two final quick barriers. This one is about assessment not lending itself to simple, easy, communicable changes. Done well, it's enormously complex and requires experiment and persistence. And if we just think about some of the complexities in reforming assessment, which we've just got here, you can have a quick look at those. You know, the difficulty of perhaps designing valid or authentic assessment, you know, the whole idea of feedback, we now understand what a demanding and complicated concept that is, if it's a concept on its own at all. Trustworthy judgment, that's coming under a lot of pressure. Involving students as assessors, something we know is really good, very useful, but is also seen as risky and unfair. So I think the complexity of assessment means that it reinforces to me the importance of improving assessment literacy of staff, but it also suggests that institutional policy really can't reflect that kind of complexity. And it should only really focus on the general direction, perhaps thinking about institutional level initiatives being much more about principles and providing people with tools, and leaving the more specific and complex detail to be generated collaboratively at the local work group level. And finally, you'll be pleased to hear in terms of barriers, I think we've got to recognise that universities are, as somebody says, complex adaptive systems operating in a turbulent and unpredictable environment. They often have multiple goals which change over time and can be mutually contradictory. Policies are often not joined up. Indeed, as Emma says again, Emma Medlin, different drivers for assessment reform conflict with each other. At the moment, we've got this kind of stuff coming down about GPA, which encourages people to focus on grades, at the same time as we've got the long-standing higher education achievement reports, which actually wants us to not focus on grades, but to focus on other ways of, more sophisticated ways of representing students' achievement. So a conclusion there is that we really need to look and see whether our desired change takes account of existing institutional commitments and aims. Okay, so this discussion of barriers, I think, shows what a significant challenge it is. But I'm hoping that kind of by bringing together some of those responses that I've talked about, we can maybe begin to at least build a framework for institutional transformation assessment, at least begin to create the conditions for change. And I've sort of grouped them under 4 areas, and this is very much preliminary work, and I'd be interested in feedback: principles, infrastructure, strategy and assessment literacy. Let's just look at principles now. I think there's 4 that I've identified at this stage. One is that assessment change needs to be based on a scholarly approach, on good evidence. It also needs to respect the autonomy, the agency and the disciplinary knowledge of programme teams, a key principle. The views of different constituencies should be heard and responded to. And this I haven't talked about, but it comes through strongly from talking to people, that local teams should have control over any assessment evaluation data that is collected about their course and their students, to kind of guard against the defensiveness that might come from blame, which is interesting because, of course, at the moment, most of that information is out there in the public and is used to bash people. So that's key principles. In terms of infrastructure, I think that this is particularly important. And the sorts of areas I think it includes is actively involving QA people in any changes, and reviewing whether regulations and quality procedures support the desired change. We also need to look, I think this is particularly important, at the alignment of institutional course approval and other documentation with whatever we're trying to do in assessment. We need to make sure the discourse of those documents works with us. We need to make sure that our changes appear relatively unrisky to those who are having to do them. And I think use of group assessment is a good example there. People are very nervous about that for lots of reasons. But I think at an institutional level, if we provide a clear policy for operating group assessment, with good information for staff, I'm afraid I'm going to finish. I'm going to finish, just 2 or 3 minutes. And staff and students on the benefits, the maximum allowed on a programme, the management of social loafers, I don't like that term, fair and transparent ways of allocating student marks. We could begin to remove those anxieties if we gave people real good institutional support and guidance on it. We should look at how our desired change aligns with existing institutional commitments. Do they support each other? Are they joined up? It may be unpopular, but there really is a strong case for encouraging the reduction of student module choice. We might not like it, but I think if we want to create coherent assessment for students, we need to think about that. And finally, does program funding methodology in your university support assessment enhancement? If we're giving all the money based on contact hours and not on assessment workload, then it doesn't, I'd say. It encourages different things. So that's infrastructure. In terms of strategy, just a few things I think that come out here. We need to, as I've said before, get institutional level just focusing on principles and tools for change, and that within that, it should, we should have the specifics of change controlled at the individual work group level, and with a focus on the programme teams. I think there is an imperative to bring together all those involved in teaching and learning, and to have robust evidence of the students' experience of it. Those two have gone the other way around. I apologise for that. And also, working at the work group level, I think will help to reveal contradictory influences. we also need to look out for workload neutral change at the very minimum. And finally, to consider the risks that are likely to attend it and prepare for them. Okay, so the last one is assessment literacy. Most importantly, I think we do need to do something about improving staff assessment literacy. I think that's very important, staff and students. And this needs to include greater communication about clear and simple regulations. We need to work from the problems of groups to helping them resolve those problems rather than work from telling them what they need to do to looking at their problems, and then share share successful examples of assessment problem change. And lastly, and this is something they found in their Manchester Met, is that where it really matters for things like fair and consistent assessment procedures, then we need to have saturation CPD. We need to cut through the myths. We really need to do that well. So I've kind of really rushed these ideas, but I hope you've got a bit of an idea what the barriers are and putting together the various elements that bring us a kind of overall view of maybe at least how we might create the conditions to go forward. I have got a slide here on leadership for assessment change, which I'll let you look at your leisure, as I'm being hounded here in the front. I'll just conclude then to say that I've presented some ideas for us to think about today when we're listening to the individual presentation. I think there's an important imperative on us as a kind of research and practitioner community to build a body of evidence of successful change that institutions can draw on. We clearly face multiple things that get in the way, but I'm suggesting that a focus on these barriers may help us to assemble a range of strategies which we can use. So there's our Twitter hashtag for this conference. If anyone wants to put up some comments and ideas, thank you very much. Thank you for patiently listening.
Thanks so very much